Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute. And as many of you know, the Reagan Institute is the D.C. home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, right here in Lafayette Park, across from the White House that President and Mrs. Reagan once called home. On most days, I get to say that I have the best, if not one of the best jobs in Washington. But tonight I feel like I have the hardest job in Washington, D.C. Do you know how nerve-wracking it is to speak in front of Peggy Noonan? Most of the time, you give someone a nice introduction and they say, "I could not have written it better myself." But Peggy, she must be thinking, she is thinking, "I would have written it so much better myself." And you know what? She'd be right. That's because Peggy Noonan is truly a writer without peer. Across 5 decades, Americans have leaned on her words in times of tragedy and in moments of joy. In Ronald Reagan's hands, her speeches did more than capture history. They made history. And to this day, her columns do more than offer one woman's perspective. They speak to us. They speak for us. In my mind, Peggy Noonan is America's muse. I once heard Peggy say about this institute's namesake, Ronald Reagan, that he was a great man and he was a good man. And President Reagan said something similar of America. He said, "For America to be great, it must also be good." Goodness and greatness. Here at the Reagan Institute and our Center for Civility and Democracy, we care deeply about both. Her new book, A Certain Idea of America, is a celebration of what America has been, is, and can be. And it's needed, especially as we approach America's 250th. We need a celebration of who we are because there is still so much to celebrate. So thank you, Peggy, for publishing this book. Thank you for your service as a trustee of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute. Thank you for your lifetime of inspirational words, some that grace the walls of this institute, I might add. And thank you for being with us this evening. So join me in welcoming the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, Peggy Noonan, in conversation with our chairman of the board, Fred Ryan.
Roger, if he is still here, Roger, I found your words.
He'll be entering over there in just a minute.
Well, I found his words almost embarrassingly flattering, but that's because I did write them.
Well, thank you, Peggy. Roger, thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everybody, to the Reagan Institute. We're delighted to have you here. I have to tell you, this is an event that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. It's a great honor and fun, considering that Peggy and I, 4 decades ago, were having conversations over pizza across Lafayette Square when our offices were next door at the White House.
Yes.
And I've gotten older.
He was so tall and cute. He was tall and blonde and cute, and he had a cute girlfriend. But he was like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just quickly, Ronald and Nancy Reagan let people who had talent come in and work big jobs, even if they were only like 24 years old or 28 years old. Frank, you know this. They were open to anybody with talent, exactly like Fred, exactly like John Rogers on our board, who was like running the joint when he was like 26.
Right? Well, it's amazing that at the time Ronald Reagan was the oldest president and he had the youngest staff.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know. Actually, technically, it was one of the
Yes,
youngest.
at that time. I don't know if it's changed since then, but that was the youngest staff.
I totally believe it. We were 20 and 30 and running amok. It was fabulous.
Right.
Just, oh my God. But he was quite wonderful. I haven't been serious about Fred. Organizational, no. Now everything I say is just going to sound goofy because I am in a slightly goofy mood. But Fred was a very strong guy who had his eye on what should happen and how the place should run and how to keep it running orderly, but also how to imagine what we ought to be doing a year from now, which does involve having a vision. So I was always impressed. Did I ever tell you?
No, but you know
Oh
what?
my
I was
God,
going to
you
say,
had no idea. I was
Roger,
so impressed.
that's the kind of introduction you need to get. So should we get started? Because
Yes.
I have questions, and we're going to open up the questions from our group tonight. And I thought, since we're right here at the Reagan Institute in Washington, thank you for starting your tour here in Washington, D.C. The question I wanted to ask you is, 40 years ago, you began working for President Reagan. What do you know about him now, over the past 40 years, that you didn't know when you were working for him?
When I was in my early 30s working for Ronald Reagan, the sheer pace of life was so quick and dense and demanding. And I did not always have time to reflect. Luckily, I kept notes, but I simply didn't always have time to reflect and think about Ronald Reagan. He was always someone I was trying to understand. Politically, you know, I came into the Reagan White House not knowing him. I knew exactly who he was politically and exactly who he was philosophically. I'd been following him since I was a kid. I met him when I was in college. I interviewed him for a college magazine. So that I knew, that I was confident in, but the personal Reagan, who he was not a mystery to me, but not a full picture. One of the things I've really thought about him a lot in the decades since we were there with him. When he would walk down the hall, and you know, the old executive office building is a big office building with lots of hallways. And I remember if Reagan came over from the White House and was having meetings in the old EOB or meeting with anybody individually in their office, it wasn't announced in advance. You didn't get a note saying the president will be in the EOB today. But if you were walking down those broad EOB halls with the beautiful black and white marbled floors, and you're walking one way and suddenly you hear a bunch of people laughing, I would think, I bet Reagan's there. And I'd keep going, and around the corner would come Reagan and an entourage of aides. So he was, for me, he was always introduced by laughter. I've thought about him and his character so many times over the years. I wrote an entire book about him, and half really of another book about him. The biggest thing I think that I came to understand was that he was a very friendly, genial, and kind-hearted introvert. That's how I see him. I don't know if this will sound right to you. You knew him better than I did. But so many politicians are extroverts. They achieve their fullness in dealing with other people. If you're Bill Clinton, a wonderful extrovert, he becomes his happiest self talking to and dealing with and touching the other humans. He really becomes his Bill Clinton at that point. Reagan was, to me, the opposite. Reagan was kindly, genial, and friendly, and he would give you himself, but he wanted it back.
Right.
And himself existed quite readily without you, or quite easily without you. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in a good way. He had a vivid inner life. So a friendly introvert, I guess, is one of the biggest things. Second thing I realized is he was so happy reading at his desk or drawing sometimes, writing people letters, being in touch with people through writing. it's funny, he is famous for what he said in a way, but he was happiest, I think, not saying. What do you think?
Well, you spent a lot of time with him in public and in private, and one of the things that always struck me, and I would ask you if you feel the same way, is he's one of those rare political figures who is the same whether the camera is on or the camera is off.
Totally, totally. You know, it's such a cliche to say what you see is what you get, but with Reagan, really, what you saw was what you got. I was thinking the other day about the notes of when Reagan first met with Gorbachev. They, of course, had note keepers there who are keeping the notes for the Russian archives and for the American archives and for people who need to know exactly what was said. And the Russian note taker couldn't help himself. I could see in his notes that he fell in love with Reagan in his private talks with Gorbachev. Now, it was not the job of the Russian note taker at the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting to fall in love with Reagan. But he wrote, "This is a genial, soft-spoken man, but funny. If you criticize his country or attack it, he comes out like a lion!" Exclamation point. And you could tell the note taker approved of the lion. So I think of that sort of thing when I think of Reagan. He was not two-faced. For a politician, for a political figure, he was amazingly genuine. He never thought he had to play another role. He only had to be himself. So all of this, in a way, it's so obvious and it's sort of a cliche, but I still can't get over it because it was so remarkable.
I have some more things I want to ask you about President Reagan, but before that, a couple things about the book. And one thing that certainly caught my attention, not just in the book, but as a devoted reader of your column over the years, is the sheer variety of work that you do. I was just looking, you've done columns on Tom Wolfe, Oscar Hammerstein, Taylor Swift, Bob Dylan, Ulysses S. Grant, Leo Tolstoy. So when you sit down to write your column, what is it you look for?
I am happiest writing a column when I have been having thoughts about history or culture and have had the week previous to be reading the history and the culture and backing up what my sort of thoughts are. My feeling is, you know, my column comes out online Thursday night, but a lot of people read it in the newspaper Saturday morning, literally in a newspaper. It's so touching to me.
Right.
But I constantly meet people who read it in the paper. It makes me so happy. But Saturday morning, I think, is a time for, on Saturday morning, you don't have to be, what's the information, what's the data? Saturday morning, you're planning your day, you're having your coffee, you're reading the papers, you can reflect, you can have a good time, and you can have fun thinking about things that you were not thinking about all week, such as how Oscar Hammerstein gave great interviews about what it was to be an American and what it was. You know, Hammerstein was asked, he was one of the great voices of Broadway of the late 40s and 50s and 60s. Rodgers and Hammerstein,
right.
The greatest lyricist, which means a real artist and a real writer. But he was asked once by Mike Wallace of CBS News in a long interview, you Broadway guys, you show business guys, you Hollywood guys, you're all liberal, right? And he said, yeah, I guess we are. He didn't say, no, that's wrong, you know, you're generalizing, we have 3 conservatives. No, he just said, no, yeah, I guess we are. And then he explained why he was a liberal, and he explained how he saw America. And it was so touching that I came upon it by accident one day, and I just thought, I want to tell America in a column about why this guy was so great and why his attitude of honesty, kind candor, was the kind of thing we ought to be emulating. So anyway, a shorter answer is on Saturday mornings, I feel I can write about where my heart goes a little bit, and I do. And those columns, even though they're a self-indulgence in a way, they wind up being the most popular columns. And I hear from so many people about them. And it makes me happy.
Well, talking about your writing, I know this year is a big year for you, a double big year, a triple big year, because you shared with us earlier that you became a grandmother 2 weeks ago.
I did.
Which is wonderful news. And professionally, 25 years at the Wall Street Journal this year.
Yes, in January.
In January.
It's so shocking to me.
And 50 years of being a professional writer. Now, I didn't know kindergartners could be professional writers, but what is it that you have observed over the 25 years of the Journal, 50 years as a professional writer? What have you observed in your work?
Oh gosh, America became more complicated and less normal, I would say, in my lifetime as a writer. Gosh, that is a big question. America, maybe the biggest change I have seen in America in the past 50 years is the technological revolution that came upon us 30 years ago, bringing so much good, like you can email people you'd been out of touch with, like you can amuse yourself with a film on YouTube that you thought didn't even exist anymore. Oh my God, technology is so wonderful. It allows your kids to be in touch with you, by which I mean they don't want to be in touch with you, but you can find them, and they're going to have to respond sooner or later. It allows you, the night my grandson, Peter, was coming, it looked like my daughter-in-law would have a long labor. And by about 2 o'clock in the morning, my son texted me because of the wonders of technology. And he said, "Mom, go to sleep. Don't still be up. It's going to be hours yet. All the doctors have told me that." So I fell blissfully asleep for 2 hours, came awake at 4 a.m., picked up my phone, went like this, and saw the picture of a baby who had come about 4 a.m., who had stolen in the middle of the night. So technology is wonderful. It changed my life. I was not a person who could, in my, after I worked in the White House, I beg your pardon, I wrote my first book, What I Saw at the Revolution. And then I was bringing up a son on my own, making a living, and in the terrible position of being, I was not good at calling editors and pitching ideas, and I was living as a freelance writer. But when the internet came in, I didn't have to call them. I could just send them an email and talk them into it. And they'd say, okay, 800 words. And that was how I made my living. So I love technology, but it has also made us a stranger and sicker country. We know all the ways in which it has. And I worry about it endlessly, as we all do. It has occurred to me that my son and daughter-in-law will have to expend a lot of effort now with all that we know about the bad side of tech. My son and daughter-in-law will have to expend a lot of effort to protect their son from the screens, from all the screens and everybody else's screens. It's going to be interesting, but that's the biggest change. And it's so transformative. Oh, I beg your pardon. It's unbelievable.
Well, Peggy, one thing I've learned about you over the years, and I think all of your faithful readers know, is your precision with language. You are always precise. And you've named this book A Certain Idea of America. Can you tell us what made you select that title?
Two things. One is Charles de Gaulle, in his wartime memoirs, famously began his really great memoirs with such a simple sentence that was so Charles de Gaulle. This sentence is most happily translated is, "It has such a modest sound for such a conceited man." And he was conceited, and he had earned his conceit. He was an authentically great man. But he began with the simple sentence, "All of my life I have had a certain idea of France." And when I read that years ago, it just electrified me. But I also knew that it was electrifying me in part because there was autobiography in it on my part, all of my life I had a certain idea of America, that it was good, that it deserves and needs our protection, that it deserves our protective loyalty, that it must be continued generation after generation, that it was a new thing in history, a sparkling advance for mankind in history. I've always taken that seriously, and as I go through my work, really, it's just a theme in my work. After the and a, maybe the most frequent word I use is America. It is my happy obsession.
That's wonderful. Looking at your columns over the years, you have not hesitated to oppose Republicans and Democrats. But you always seem to hope for the best of both parties, particularly after the election.
Like an idiot.
But what? No. What does this tell you? Are you a secret Republican or a secret Democrat or a secret agent, or what is it?
The best way I can describe myself is as a conservative. I have the impulses of a conservative. I want to conserve. I want to protect. I don't believe in grand revolutionary schemes. I don't believe in change that is not also progress, and progress that is discernible. I have an intuitive sense of connection to the forms and traditions of the past. If you put in your Twitter bio that your name is Mary and you do parentheses, she, her, I do not think more of you for doing she, her. It was okay for 2,000 years. Let's just keep it the way it is. So these are the impulses of a conservative. Protect your country, be good to your country. Don't be looking for trouble in the world, but occasionally you'll have to defend yourself. Fine, be strong, be peaceful. We've got a very powerful democratic republic. It's powerful, but it can be a little frail too, so look out for it. So all these are the impulses of a conservative. Wherever I see some outshoot of conservatism, my heart is made glad. I think the two-party system is what was more or less dictated by our Constitution. If that is so, then I would like both parties to be in good shape, not bad shape. And I like to encourage what I think are good things within them, and damn what I think are bad things within them. I have gotten, as I've grown older, I was never much of a partisan, but I used to be more of a right-wrong person. Now I'm a little bit more of a, we can sort of round this off at the edges a little bit. Let's just A, protect the country, and B, hold together, because history in the future will be a hard future. And so whatever things hold us together, those are the things I am most interested in promoting and being helpful about.
Great. You mentioned your book, When Character Was King, which of your many books, that is one of my favorites.
Thank you.
And you talked about President Reagan's success because of his character. Can you describe his character, what it was that made character king for him?
Courage. It was courage, but it wasn't. Reagan's courage, it seemed to me, was not battlefield courage. He was not. A hero of World War II was a fellow named Audie Murphy. Remember? Yeah. In Germany, I believe it was Germany, or I'm blocking on where the heck he was, but he was in the European War, not in the Pacific. And he just jumped, his company comes under German attack. This guy on his own jumps on a tank with 2 guns, bang, 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 takes out the bad guys, protects the good guys. Audie Murphy was a great American. Ronald Reagan knew who Audie Murphy was. So that's Audie Murphy courage, which is, baby, don't even try. And a moment of real blazing glory and bravery. Reagan had the harder kind of courage. We can't know. He was never in an Audie Murphy circumstance. We don't know what he would have done. But Reagan in his life and in his career, I think portrayed the harder kind of courage, which is the daily and exhausting swimming against the tide and not losing heart and keeping going, even though it's a little exhausting because you know you're going in the right direction. And it would be easy to get out of the river and rest on the shore with the nice people who say, where you ought to be, with us. And he'd say, no, the right direction is this direction. I got to stay swimming. I always think of him as a swimmer. And of course, you know better than anybody, in Reagan's last years, he thought of himself as the swimming lifeguard that he had been as a college boy, forgetting he was president, but remembering he was a lifeguard. And I think of him that way. I think of him swimming against the tide.
Courage being a big part of his character. So let's come to the present.
It makes every other part of your good character shine, because every part of you that's good took some guts.
So today, how important is character in political life?
Not at all important, Fred. And we're so happy because it's not important. It will always be important. People can see character, they can see an attempt to be good. It's not true that an attempt to have a high character will necessarily be rewarded in your lifetime. But I do believe it will always be seen in retrospect and seen for what it is afterwards. I don't really want to whine or complain or damn. I think I go to a church where every Sunday we pray for our leaders, world leaders, American leaders, and we sincerely pray. So let me just say we've been praying a lot. We're just going nuts praying these days at St. Thomas More Church in the heart of Manhattan.
Keep praying, please.
We do it it's literally part of the Mass.
Let me ask you about something else. When President Reagan would often talk about heroes and heroism, and some of his most notable addresses that you worked with him on, the boys at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, and the space shuttle after the explosion of the space shuttle. He talked about heroes and heroism.
Yes.
How important was that to him, and how important is that today? Are heroes a thing of a bygone era, or are there more heroes today?
Oh, no. As long as there are humans, there will be heroes, full stop. Outstanding moments from outstanding human beings. You know, Reagan, I met with Reagan after the Pointe du Hoc speech, which he pronounced correctly as Pointe du Hoc, but all of the rest of us mispronounced, and to this day call it Pointe du Hoc. But I met with him afterwards, and he told me the most moving moment of the Pointe du Hoc speech for him was this. You know, the U.S. Rangers who had climbed up the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc just heroically sent up cliffs with grappling hooks and ropes to get to the top to take out guns that they expected were there. You know, just 20-year-old boys from nowhere, USA. So the White House had gathered as many of them as could be done, and they sat in a section just like this. And they had no idea, those men, that what they had done as boys was about to be so seen and so lauded and so celebrated. And as they listened to Reagan sincerely talking about what they'd done and what it meant, well, a bunch of them burst into tears. Poor Reagan couldn't burst into tears, but wanted to, but was very moved by these men. That was really Reagan and those men. That was the beginning of the greatest generation. Nobody had ever spoken of it before Ronald Reagan. He did it that day. Reagan told me that right before, oh gosh, at the moment I can't remember if it was right before or right after the speech and the boys being in the front rows. I think it was that morning, a bunch of kids, by 20 and 25-year-old U.S. Army Rangers, had met at the bottom of the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and decided to reenact the taking of the cliffs. So they got out there with their hooks and their ropes and they're throwing and they're climbing. Two of the old Pointe du Hoc guys, aged now 65, they kind of got into it. They said, "Hey kid, throw me a rope." And they made it to the top. Reagan told me about the old guys making it to the top. And he just said, this is so simple, but I'll never forget it. He said, "Boy, that was something." Like, that was the height of his moment there. That was the height of the 40th anniversary of D-Day for him, that the boys still had it in them and could still do it.
That was great. Just to talk a little bit about the space shuttle speech, because that was the days, we remember, President Reagan was going to give the State of the Union address.
Oh, God, yes, you remember it so well.
And of course, and actually, President Reagan would recognize the various heroes in the State of the Union address as this is tradition. And one of them was a young student who had an experiment on the space shuttle. And they were supposed to be meeting President Reagan shortly, and they were in my office, and we said, "Let's watch the space shuttle take off." And it took off.
Oh my God, I never knew this part.
And it exploded, and right, of course,
right in front of your eyes as you watched
with this
TV.
young student. So anyway, we got the word over to President Reagan. So the change was made, but the country was really sad and disturbed, and the loss of life, our fear in our technology and our future in space. And President Reagan, within hours, addressed the nation, and he turned to you to help him on that. Can you talk a little bit about how that came together?
It was funny. It was just another day at work. The speechwriting department was busy and not busy. It was busy because they were taking in the last-minute changes and edits on the State of the Union, the big yearly address, the biggest that was going on that night. But I had nothing to do with that year's State of the Union, so I was really doing quieter stuff in my office. I was on the phone with somebody when I saw out of the corner of my eye something happened on the TV screen. It was like I'd been watching on CNN the space shuttle go up, and suddenly there was like a spiky white cloud going in different directions. I couldn't figure out what it was. Rang off the phone, leaned forward, and with the clicker put the volume up so that I could understand what I was seeing. And all I could hear of the volume was static. CNN was very obviously, they had nobody there who could tell you what had happened because they didn't know. Or if they thought they knew, they couldn't say it because it was too crazy to say it blew up. So they switched to the NASA Johnson Space Center line, and that was static. And so I knew this exploded, and it did not appear that it was anything but a disaster. And I went into my boss's office, Ben Elliott, who ran speech writing, who Fred knew so well. I said, Ben was on 2 phones. And I said, Ben, you're going to have to change the State of the Union tonight, whatever happens, but I'm going to write either a speech or an insert because something's going to have to be done. This cannot not be talked about. And I just settled myself down, started to do my work. President Reagan, when the shuttle blew up, had been meeting with network anchors to give them a preview of the State of the Union. So he was having lunch with a bunch of network anchors. He was called away from the lunch and told, "Mr. President." He then went to the TV and watched it. There's a wonderful picture of him just with his face washed with concern as he looks down at a TV set that is clearly showing you the explosion. Reagan then went back, so courteous. He never had to go back to the lunch with the anchors down the hall, but he would never let anybody just leave in a crisis. He would say goodbye to them. So he met with them, and he said, we've just had a terrible moment. We're not sure of everything that has happened, but this is what we know so far. And the anchors, being journalists, immediately asked him questions about his reaction, the meaning of it, the whole deal. Luckily, a young woman from the National Security Council was sitting in the back of the lunch and taking notes. She took her notes, she walked over to speech writing to Ben Elliott, and she said, this is what the president just said. He said, give it to Peggy. And so that became the spine of the speech. We got it done very quickly. The only good thing about immediate challenge is that people can't run around fussing. We had to do work, and we had to get the work done, and we had to get this done. And so it was relatively okay. And I'll just finish this up with, when the president came on and spoke, I could see the changes that he'd made. But Reagan had a funny affect. He was appropriately upset and crestfallen, but a leader and an explainer. But I could see by the end of the speech, he didn't feel it had done the job. He didn't feel Abe Lincoln had a phrase. He'd say of a speech that didn't work, that didn't scour. That didn't cut through the land like a good plow. I could see in Reagan's eyes that didn't scour. And you know what? There was no way, there were no words that could make anybody feel better. There were no words that could soften this jarring tragedy. We'd never had one like it, losing astronauts during a space flight. So anyway, I went home sad that night. He went back to the residence sad. State of the Union called off, held in the future. And Reagan was a little blue, and then Frank Sinatra called. Now, Frank Sinatra was a beloved friend of Ronnie and Nancy, and Frank Sinatra was their supporter, but Frank Sinatra didn't call after every speech. And Reagan picked up, and Sinatra told him that was everything that should have been said, that absolutely, don't be blue. Because Reagan told him, I don't feel so good. He said, no, it was right. And Reagan kind of reconsidered after that. I know this story because I came in to work the next day, and there were all these messages from people like Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill and Secretary of State George Shultz, people who, believe me, did not call me. And I'm looking at the little pink notes, and then Reagan called, and he was so gracious and so lovely and thanked me for my work and talked about the day. And then he said that he had not felt we had hit it. And I said, Mr. President, I could just tell. And he said, but then Frank called me. And I really reconsidered it based on what he said. And I thought, well, if Frank's happy, I'm happy. What the heck? But that was quite a day.
I bet. Well, thank you for taking us behind the scenes. Talking about today, we just came through an election that shows that we're a fairly divided country.
No, we're not.
Not, okay.
I'm deep into denial these days.
So my question to you is this, though. If you look back over history, we have had times where we're very divided. We've had very close presidential elections. In 1960, Kennedy and Nixon, it was a very, very close election. The country was divided.
Absolutely.
And then a generation later, Ronald Reagan won 49 out of 50 states.
Landslideville.
We'll
never see that again.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Does the pendulum go back and forth? Do you think we will head back to be more united in the way we were when he got 49 out of 50 states, or do you think that's just something won't happen again?
Well, I can just say that we have not for some years been in landslide territory. We have been a pretty divided country, and it's been pretty closely divided. I actually take some comfort in the fact that we're only split in two. I take some comfort in the fact that we're not split into 14 pieces. You know, we're not like some absurdist European democracy that has like coalition governments that never work and everybody's unhappy and drunk. That's not what we do. So I'm grateful that's not us. I'm grateful it's two parties. They let us down continually. I am hopeful that they will get better. A matter of hope to me would be the Democratic Party is either now going to save its own life or fail and die. Here's why I say that. They don't know what they stand for anymore, which means they can sit down, think about it, and figure it out, and learn to offer something better than the Republicans. That's really possible. But right now, on all of the standard political issues, the Democrats are just in a disastrous territory. The Democratic Party that I came up with, I'm from a Democratic family, Irish Catholic, Brooklyn, Long Island. Democratic Party when I was a kid and a young woman, it was the party of the working man. It was the party of the little guy. Well, they're not that anymore. They're the party of the academic administrator at Brown. So they're not the little guy and the working man. They are not the party of generous spending. You know, Donald Trump will say, hold my beer. You want to see generous spending? And they were, when I was coming up, the party of the anti-war party. And now Republicans have taken on that mantle, and the Democrats are not in that place. Okay, they're going to have to invent the meaning of their purpose in history, the Democratic Party. And who knows, they may get sound and stable and put up a good fight. I know, laughter. Who knows? Oh, let's all get drunk.
All right, well, before we do, we have a couple of questions, but I just want to ask you one other thing, maybe while we get ready for the questions, and that is, you write about Washington, you have such unique perspective on Washington, but at the same time, you have the sense of the every person, every man across the country, and you live in New York City. How do you manage to triangulate that?
Well, part of it is the technology I'm so eager to warn about. You know, senators and congressmen are not in Washington as much as they used to be. They're here 3 days a week. Right. They text me and call me. So I kind of have a sense of what they're thinking. I sort of don't think I have to be here to know that. Yeah. What I do miss out on as a writer is if I lived here in Washington in the belly of the beast, I would have a wonderful, better sense of the culture of the federal city, and I'd hear the overheard remark in the restaurant that is so revealing. So I kind of miss out on that, but I'll tell you what I gain in living away from it. I live in New York, which is not a town that is only about government. And as I look at Washington, I think of it as it. That makes me exactly like the rest of the American people who also look at Washington and think of it as it. What did it do now? Do you know what it's doing about Social Security? So it balances off. I live in New York because I love it, and I'm a New Yorker, and I'm from there, and it's my town. In a way, I lived in Washington for 5 years and lived vividly and in a very dramatic way, but it was not my town. It was a fabulous place I'd always want to come to, but not my town.
So how about time for a couple of questions? Marcia, do you have a question?
Marcia?
If we'll get you a microphone. Gloria? Gloria, okay. Gloria has got a question. Take the mic. Here you go.
Okay, I've got to think about this. I shared your column on how this country could take a hard election with some people who, you know, were young and devastated, and some people who were older and sleepless. And what was your inspiration for that? You said a little earlier you wrote it for yourself.
Yeah,
But, it
we
was so comforting.
I had friends. This was, I think, a week before the election took place, before voting day. I had friends who were sort of entering what almost looked like outward breakdown over this election. I had friends who told me they could no longer sleep at night. I had friends bursting into tears. This happened on both sides, but more among Democrats, it seemed to me, than among Trump supporters. Trump supporters felt confident and more zippy than Democrats did. They had a little spring in their step. And I wanted my friends who I love, I wanted to say to them, we are a tough country. We are stronger than we know. We can get through a lot. We will get through a lot. We can take it. Our whole history is we can take it. So I wrote it just kind of to say, here, context. Feel better, we will get through. And only a few days later did I realize I did not just write that for my friends, I wrote it for myself. I was talking to myself, as happens sometimes, you know. You think it's for others, and then you realize, no, that was for me. That was me saying buck up to me. So that's ironic, but true.
Looks like we have in the second row, we have a question over there. And
hello again, Ms. Noonan. My
Hello,
name is
Connor.
Connor. I'm an academic administrator at Brown University. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
No, you're not
actually-
kidding.
No, it says right here. All right, no. Just to be clear, my question isn't about any current employers I have or former. I'm actually at Department of State, but that does lead into my question. So when you and your colleagues and President Reagan and Vice President Bush and all these people up and down the chain were dealing with all these incredible decisions about the Cold War, there's a lot of hindsight bias that can say how it all worked out. But at the
Sure.
time, obviously, you didn't know for sure that things were going to work out.
Totally true.
What do you think that not just this incoming administration, but the presidency after that and after that is going to need to know as we go into these unknown situations with Russia and China, where we don't know how it's going to work out? What lessons do you think do apply, or maybe are being overlearned, even, like, you know, we can't just call it a second Cold War in the
Yeah.
same way because it's not
Yeah.
against communism or who knows what, not in the same
Yeah.
way.
This coming administration and the one after that and after that will be, whether they announce it or not, whether they put it into words or not and declare it or not, they will be deciding America's role in the world. They will be deciding, is the world safer with a strong American presence in it and helping to shape events? Is America safer being a strong presence and helping to shape events? Or can we withdraw? Have we been too distracted by the clamor and impelled a little bit with our own ego and our own cocky sense of who we are? Has that distorted our thinking? Should we be trying in a way to be a receding wave? Will that make us safer? Will that make the world safer? So the coming administrations, whether they declare it or not, will be deciding that. One thing I would say for the coming administration, just one observation, is that you can have philosophical and abstract arguments about America and its roles and desirable duties in the world. But the funny thing you can find out, and I think you will find out, is that if you decide we should be receding as a wave, in a way, not be bothering so much in the world and with its problems. If you think that you can decide that and the world will not drag you back in and drag at you and try to hurt you as you make yourself safer, I think you will find you are wrong. That's another way of saying, I'm not saying this so clearly, but probably the great dismayer and disruptor of the world is not America. And so if it becomes more withdrawn in the world, I don't think you will find the world to be a safer place, and I don't think you'll find that the world is happy to say, thank you for leaving, we love you so much. Let's have a cultural exchange, but we'll never bother you again. That won't happen.
Thank you very much.
The natural, who said this? Was it Aristotle or Plato or Socrates? But one of those guys said the natural state of man is war. You have to go forward knowing that, hoping for the best, trying for the best, trying to make the best happen, but be ready.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peggy.
Thank you.
I just got the word. We have run out of time, but I do want to say one thing, one bit of good news, and particularly
Yes.
for the people who are watching this on the video stream, is the conversation with Peggy is going to continue on December 4th at the Reagan Presidential Library in
Yay.
California. And you probably don't know this, and it's always, I don't know you like having surprises pulled on you, but we did a little research, and that day, by coincidence, is the day 40 years ago that Ronald Reagan announced a bright young speechwriter named Peggy Noonan to be special assistant to the President of the United
Oh
States.
my gosh, no kidding.
Absolutely.
Oh, that touches me so much. You know, I will never forget that day because I missed the announcement. Because I didn't know anybody was making an announcement, and the White House is a busy place, and you just might forget to tell a kid they just got a boost. But I will never forget that I was told afterwards that Larry Speaks, who announced it among 14 other announcements at the end of a briefing, he said of mine, he said, oh, that's a battlefield commission. Because we had just been through the election and we had all just fought it together. So December 4th was about a month after the election. But I'll never forget that. But how gracious of you to find that. Thank you very much. It makes me happy. Thank you, dear. I love him. We were children together. So thank you guys for coming.